Welcome to the Emmanuel Levinas Center at the Lithuanian University of Health Sciences. I'm very happy to introduce a very interesting initiative, a series of lectures that will be led by Professor Sandor Goodhart. And Sandor Goodhart is a recognized expert in Levinas and philosophy. He is Professor Emeritus of Jewish and English Studies at Purdue University, the United States of America. He is a former director of the Religious Studies Program, Jewish Studies Program, Philosophy and Literature Program, and the Classical Studies Program. Professor Sandor Goodhart is the author and editor of 7 books on literature, philosophy, Jewish studies. Also, Professor is a founding board member of the North American Levinas Society. Before giving board to Professor, also I would like to mention that this project is funded by the Baltic American Freedom Foundation that made this series of events possible. And thanks for that. So, dear Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Tobias. Thank you very much for your very kind words. Is my voice okay? Can you hear it? Sound-wise? So, this is an experiment. It's an experiment. We're doing something that's basically new, as I understand the project from my conversations with Tobias and others. And what we're trying to do is take the work of the philosopher whose namesake is part of this building, Emmanuel Levinas Center, Emmanuel Levinas, and see to what extent his thinking, in particular regarding responsibility, would apply to the field of practical field of medical ethics. It seems to me that it would be a natural, and as it turns out, there was an article I just happened to stumble upon, written 2 years ago, on Levinas and medical ethics. I think neither of us knew about this article by a man named Lazar Benaroya, and we will print up so that you can we'll make it digitally available to you, so you can actually look at this article, and we'll read this in the 6th session. But in getting started here, what I want to say is I want to describe the course, and then I want to describe some of what I would say the principles of my approach to what's going on here. So the course will meet, as Professor Levinas has said, on 6 successive meetings on Tuesday and Thursday of this week, the next week, and the following week. So this is the 17th, 19th, 24th, 26th, 1st, and the 3rd. Today we're going to talk about the philosophy of Levinas. I'm going to give a kind of introduction to the philosophy of Levinas. And in particular, I find this particular book especially helpful, The Ethics and Infinity, translated by Richard Cohen, who is also a frequent visitor to the Emmanuel Levinas Center, and has translated other works of Levinas. And we will then I will go through in a summary fashion, hopefully with questions from the audience and from the digital world that's looking at this, and try to get at how Levinas may be used to approach medical ethics, in particular bioethics. But in order to do that, I'm going to give an introduction to Levinas's work, and then I'm going to talk in particular about the field in which I was trained. Before I was trained in philosophy, I was trained in literary reading, and I was a professor of literature at Purdue University. I picked up 4 works that I thought would be valuable in tracing the history of responsibility and ways in which responsibility gets understood in a literary context. And we'll start with the ancient Greeks and look at Sophocles' play Oedipus Tyrannus, and then we will turn to Euripides' play The Bacchae, sometimes called The Contest. And then we will look at Shakespeare's play Othello, which is another dramatic version of what seems to me is responsibility, a way in which one could approach thinking of responsibility. And then finally, Dostoevsky, who is extremely important for Levinas. I remember the one and only time that I visited Levinas, I saw a complete set of his works of Dostoevsky up on his shelf there. So he was clearly a very avid reader of the works of Dostoevsky. And when we first talked about starting this course, I thought we would do one of the short novels. But Dostoevsky tends to write large long novels. And so I would look for a shorter one, and I thought Nostrum and Underground might be. But that's 90 pages. And I thought, it might, we can make the point that we want to make by looking at one particular short story of Dostoevsky's, which is a dream of a ridiculous man, which is one of the last stories that he wrote. And he wrote this after Brothers Karamazov. He didn't plan on dying after Brothers Karamazov. He actually planned to make Brothers Karamazov one of 3 books, but he didn't live. We know from the notebooks that he wrote, he didn't live to complete that particular trilogy. But he did write a story which ends with a discussion of responsibilities. I thought it would be really appropriate for us to end our little treatment of a kind of Levinasian view of literature in that way. And then, so that would take us through today, 4 more sessions, and then the final session of this grouping, this project, this course, whatever we want to call it, would be a kind of workshop that would be led by my colleague, Levinas, and in which we would talk about how we can specifically apply and work through these ideas with regard to medical ethics. What kind of questions would come up with regard to medical ethics that might be helped by looking at Levinas or thinking about Levinas in the way which we talked about. So, with that in mind, I want to begin now to just talk about some, what I would think of as some principles of Levinasian reading that we're going to do today. And in particular, I want to begin with 2 distinctions. But actually, before I do that, I want to re-emphasize that this is an experiment. So we're going to be trying things, and we could conceivably be even altering. We won't alter the syllabus. The syllabus is set and is the way it is. But we may alter our approach to some materials in the course of these weeks as we develop this project. It's an ongoing project. It's not been scripted. You're watching it live as it's taking place for the first time. And it's particularly new because although Levinas likes great literature, I'll say more about that in a minute, he has some antipathy to literature. So to say that a Levinasian approach to literature is being used here is not without some requirement of further discussion. The primary goal here is to learn to read. And I come from a type of literary reading which is designated as close reading. It sounds somewhat banal. Close reading, we all do close reading. Well, in fact, I think close reading is extremely important. And we don't all do close reading. We tend to skim more and more, for example, with the internet. We tend to skim things and not read them very closely. But what Levinas is trying to urge us to do as an activity that's intimately bound up with the ethical is to read closely. Not only to read closely literature, not only to read closely philosophic texts, which are his mainstay, but to read closely cultural developments, cultural happenings. And in fact, he has developed what I don't think it's entirely his own making, but he has developed a species of philosophic method that is dependent on close reading. And the method that he has developed is called phenomenology. And for him, phenomenology, which is, it was in existence before him, he actually borrows that term from Edmund Husserl, and Edmund Husserl uses that term to mean intentionalities. But not intentionalities as ideas that people have in their heads, but actions, performatives, things that are going on in front of us. And so what phenomenology studies for Levinas is what's taking place. So he'll do, for example, a phenomenology of fatigue, a phenomenology of indolence, a phenomenology of sleeping. These ideas came to him when he was a prisoner of war in France, and he thought that we tend not to read what it means to be fatigued, to understand. We might want to think about whether, we might want to think about it biologically, but what does it mean in terms of an action that's taking place either in the body or in the mind with regard to the body? So we'll be talking about that. In fact, I want to just one further remark on that line. Levinas defines his work as a phenomenology of sociality. Phenomenology of sociality. And sociality is not as common a term as one would hope that it is. It's extremely important for Levinas. And what it has to do with is a movement that took place really in French critical thinking when that thinking turned to in the 20th century, returned to a thinker like Emmanuel Durkheim, and the importance of not only individuals, but of a social that is not made of simply of a collection of individual behaviors, a social that's fundamentally different. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, I could be wrong about this, but I think that socialité in French was first used by Durkheim in this very strict, new philosophic sense, that there is something that becomes in French le symbolique in certain forms, but it's something that's different from the collection of individual behaviors, and it's either larger or smaller, but it's absolutely different. In some contexts, this notion of socialité is linked to the notion of the sacred, and sometimes Durkheim is invoked to say that the sacred is never simply a collection of behaviors that take place in society, but it's something different. It has a mechanism and a life of its own, the sacredness. For Durkheim, and Levinas picks up on that, and that's actually an idea that is important for a number of French thinkers. I'm thinking of Lévi-Strauss, Jacques Lacan, Roland Barthes, Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, and a number of others, Religio as well. But for Levinas, it's pinpointed as a socialité, or we can say in English, sociality, and in particular a phenomenology of sociality. What's taking place? What's happening? What's going on? What is someone doing in what we could call the realm of social? Okay, so to get started, I want to say just very briefly something about the biography of Levinas, and then what I want to do is turn to what I think of as a chart. I've made up a chart that I published in one of my books some years ago, actually, 2012, 2012. And it's really a way of talking, it's a way of registering, for me, what's going on in the two major books of Levinas, which are Totality and Infinity, and otherwise than be Autrement qu'être. Totalité infinie and Autrement qu'être, au-delà de passé, au-delà de, beyond essence, au-delà de l'essence. Okay, so biography, very simply, and for more extended biography, I would refer you to Solomon Malka, who has written a really fine book on biography, and there are some other essays also of a biographical nature about Levinas. But what's important for me is that Levinas, in this context, and one of the reasons that we decided to do this, was born in Kaunas, and his family was in Kaunas, and he left Kaunas to study in Strasbourg in Kaunas, I believe in the early 20s, if I'm not mistaken. And then he eventually ended up the end of the 20s in Freiburg. He went to Freiburg because Husserl was giving a course there, and it looked like Husserl was, I believe, he knew in advance was going to retire, and he wanted to meet Husserl and interact with his work. And he had already started working on a dissertation which had to do with Husserl, a notion that he found in Husserl of intuition, and that was Levinas's dissertation. But so he went there, and Husserl did, in fact, during the first semester, retire, and then a young student of Husserl, who was succeeding Husserl in his place at Freiburg, his name was Martin Heidegger. And Heidegger came in and developed something significantly different that was very impressive to Levinas and a number of others in the first years of the 30s. it changed somewhat in tone as the politics of Germany changed at the end of the 30s, and that's a different discussion. But in the beginning, what was important for Levinas was this notion of this fundamental ontology, the ways in which for Heidegger what was fundamental in philosophy was the study of being, study that being had not been studied significantly or enough in Heidegger's mind. And when Levinas was interviewed once, he was asked, well, what is it about Heidegger that impressed you? And he said that being is a verb. That being is a verb. It's not simply a thing, or there are simply beings. But being to be is to do something. It's a form. It's a verb. And then after he graduated and he moved to Paris. He moved, I guess, from Strasbourg to Paris, and then the war came, and I believe he became a French citizen, and then which meant that he was required to join the army, and he was taken prisoner. He was not sent to a concentration camp, is my understanding, but to a prisoner of war camp, knowing also that he's Jewish, nonetheless, that he was not sent to a concentration camp. But David Ansel knows much more about that, and Georgie Ansel than I do, and one could follow up with David Ansel or Georgie Ansel. But then after the war, he begins to, and he had written some things after he wrote his dissertation. He wrote some things in the 30s. There's a book that's translated by Bettina Bergo called On Escape. But the work takes a different tone after the war when he writes his first book, which gets translated as Existence and Existence, with E-N-C-E and E-N-C-S. So the thing, existence, and creatures that exist, existence, becomes his first big book. And in many ways, that introduces this term of hypostasis, which is that you're going to find in the chart that we'll look at in a second. And then he's asked to summarize his work in another book, which he does, followed shortly after. And many of the same ideas are in existence and existence. And the second book is Time and the Other. And what he wants to argue that, we'll go through this very carefully, but in Time and the Other, that in some ways, Heidegger, who had argued that time is the horizon of being, that has in some sense for Levinas missed the boat, and that the horizon of being is the other individual, the other person, the autrui in French. Not the autre, which is simply the category of the non-self, but the autrui, the other person, and that we need to begin to think of one person and another person, and not simply time as a horizon for being. And then the big book, then Levinas becomes the head of the teaching, the preparation of Hebrew school teachers in France, and he writes what is known as his big book, which is Totality and Infinity. And then that's followed some years later by the second book that's considered to be a book. And I'll say more when we look at this chart as to why one book is considered to be they're both considered to be important. But the second book, but also different. The second book that he writes is, as I mentioned before, is Otherwise Than Being, Autre Modality. And that is where he introduces this idea of responsibility and focus on. In Totality and Infinity, he introduces the idea of the ethical, and that the ethical proceeds through the face. The idea of the ethical had actually been already broached in those two earlier books I mentioned, but the notion of the face becomes extremely important in Totality and Infinity, and linked to the ethical. And in Otherwise Than Being, responsibility becomes the mainstay, particularly chapters 3 and 4, where he articulates what I think of the gestation of the other within the same. That the other individual actually comes from us. So it's almost a relationship of gestation he's describing. And many people have pointed out that I think it's chapter 4 of Otherwise Than Being, where it in some sense childbirth becomes one way of adopting a vocabulary for how the other is absolutely different from me, but also an extension. And one has to maintain both of those ideas at the same time. The other individual is absolutely different, radically different, not simply an extension of the same, not simply an extension of me, but radically different from me, and at the same time an extension of me. Also, and the relationship of mothering or gestation would be one way medically of describing that kind of relationship to the other, and not simply in the pregnancy or the birthing process, but in social reality. Okay, and that's really what we need for our biography in terms of getting started. What I want to do now is, before we actually get to looking at ethics and infinity, which is a collection of conversations that he had with Philippe Nemo, I want to take a look at this. I guess we really covered the syllabus. We don't really need to know. Today we're just going to do the Levinasian and the Levinasian material that's presented in Ethics and Infinity, and then the next lecture will be on Oedipus. That will be on Thursday. Okay, so I think maybe what we should do now is turn to this. How are we doing this, guys? Yeah, okay. I think we need to turn to this chart. Can you put up this chart? So we do that. We're going to put that up on the. That was. Did she not send this to you? I can. Okay, I'll continue. Yeah. Okay. So on this chart, which you have, we will hopefully will see soon. What we have is a process by which I go out into the world. I begin as a self-same agency, and I go out into the world, and I build my home, and I interact with the elements, and I meet with the other individual who is also out there. And this is described in context of being, and so in some sense, Levinas has been reading Heidegger. And again, this is what I'm giving you here is the stages in totality and infinity by which Levinas describes the process of being. And the stages, we get to see the chart, are the first stage would be ego, where I establish myself as an ego. The second stage would be a relationship to the world or to the elemental. A third stage would be my relationship to where I live, my dwelling, and the work that I do in relationship to that dwelling. A fourth stage would be what enjoyment opportunities there are once I've secured for myself dwelling and labor. Another stage would be my capacity to think about meanings and signification. Another capacity would be my relationship to other people, in particular through the showing up of their face. And this is an extremely important idea for them. Everything in Italian Infinity is really leading up to the discussion of the face. And the face for Levinas is not an object. It's not opaque. You know, I can look at this book, and it's not looking at me. It's just opaque. It's just there. If I look at the face for Levinas, I'm looking, and the face is looking at me, the face to face, face en face. I'm looking at a looking. I'm looking at your looking, at my looking, at your looking, without limit. So the face is what Levinas will refer to as a gateway for the passage to what he calls the unlimited or the infinite. Now, this notion that he gets from René Descartes. And René Descartes is famous for, of course, for I think, therefore I am, je pense donc je suis. But he's also famous for understanding the God not in traditional theological terms, but specifically as the infinite, as the unlimited, right? And so For Levinas, the face becomes a version of what we could call the infinite within the finite, because people have faces, and the face is not an object, but as I say, it's a looking at a look. There's an example of it that is commonly known as it's when you look at a painting, certain older paintings, you see in a mirror, and you see, but you're looking at a mirror that's looking at you, and you follow it in, it gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. There's a word for it in art history. I'm missing them. Sometimes in philosophy they call them aporia. But it's where you look at, and there's no limit. The only limit becomes too small to see. Something gets smaller and smaller and smaller. Because you're looking at something that's looking at you, looking at it, that's looking at you, that's looking at without that. And for Levinas, that happens in the world, in faces. And so he feels that it's a gateway to the infinite within the context of the finite. And it's important for him that we get that understanding precisely right. It's not the finite within the infinite, and it's not the infinite plus the finite, but it's the infinite within the finite. And he uses a series of expressions which I really find charming, and I'd like to share, that are not as common as we might expect. It's the more within the less, he says. It's the container within the contained. The container within the contained. The more within the less, the infinite within the finite. And then, again, following this chart, and we're still moving from an ego or an agency or an egology or an egological perspective, we move to another person, but we're still operating from that other person within this egological or egoistic or egoic. It's not necessarily prideful, it's just a structure of relationships. That we operate within this egoic framework, and we encounter the other as a version of the same, except that it's precisely not the same. It's the other. Okay. But then, if we're lucky, we recognize that this other is not this other that we think of as the same, as really like us, is actually a double. And behind this other is another individual who is doing what we're doing. And is another individual. Is both doing the same thing that we're doing at the same time as another individual. Absolutely different. So it's radically other. And in French, you can trace this idea as, on one hand, l'autre, the other, and the other hand, autrui, the other individual, the neighbor, the person who's doing the same thing, but who's not necessarily simply a version of my mind or my perception. And those two sometimes get confused. And so what Levinas will do in his second book, this is all the first book, this is all the totality and infinity. What Levinas will do in the second book is retrace these several paths, from ego to elemental to dwelling to enjoyment to signification to face and to the other. He will retrace these paths in a retrogressive fashion, and we'll begin to talk about ways in which each of them have an investment in what he will identify as responsibility. And so, for example, in this movement from not the other who is the version of the same, the other that's the categorical non-same, but the radical other, the other individual, he will come back opposite the face, and he will say the face is actually the same. The face is actually speaking. And this is an important distinction for Levinas, because he wants to introduce the idea of a distinction between the same and the said. When we talk about language, I think of Thomas Sebeok in a book on semiosis and semiotics and how many different semiotic systems there are. And all of that is good and important. And Levinas is not saying there's anything wrong in that. But he's saying, in some sense, we've left something out, that's all what has been said. And we can say certain things about what has been said. But the act of saying is different from what has been said, looked at retrospectively. right? And he wants to argue that the act of saying is an act of participation in the ethical. That saying is so that speaking in language for him is an ethical activity. And when we think about it, we think in terms of the seds, but the actual saying is an ethical activity. And then that leads us to question. Remember, signification preceded the face in this chart. The chart exists in one of my books. I believe it's Prophetic Law. I think that the chart is there, so it's available in printed already. We'll try to make it available to people online, but it is available in print. And then, so the saying leads us to signification, and we now understand that what's important about signification from a responsibility perspective is the proximity of the other next to us, who's there. So we move in relationship to someone else, and we move in relationship to the extent to which we are touched or we have contact with another person through signification. And I'm going to just go to finish this chart fairly quickly. This leads Levinas to a series of other discussions, each of which will be coordinated with these several categories that I've mentioned. Again, the categories are ego elemental, the agency begins, ego elemental, dwelling, enjoyment, signification, and face, and then the other. And then the other opposite the face is saying, opposite signification is proximity, opposite enjoyment is what Levinas calls obsession, or incessance, the inability to stop. And what he has in mind there is really the potential for idolatry. It's one thing to enjoy something, another thing for that to become the center of gravity of our behavior, and then we can't stop. And what gets affected is our answerability, Levinas says. And this leads Levinas in this discussion, again, I'm just mapping this at this point, just mapping it. This leads Levinas in discussion to a discussion of suffering as the other side of labor, as the other side of dwelling. And suffering he calls radical abiding. Is the first strange way of talking about suffering. He says, we say, I won't suffer that to happen. It means allow or abide with that to happen. And he says, suffering, what we think of as experiencing suffering, raises the question of radical abiding. Do we have the capacity to abide with, to live with what is going on and to remove ourselves from what's taking place, which is maybe the process by which the body is affected. It seems to me we're getting into the medical when we begin to talk about abiding within our own body with something that's intruding in our body. Thinking of cancer and things that intrude in our body. And then this discussion for Levinas leads him to discussion of unruliness or anarchy or non-indifference as a relationship to the elemental. The elemental is the universe, it's the world, it's rocks. But it's fairly indifferent to us. I mean, you can, certain people think there's a rock that has a life. I remember there are people who are arguing that, the life of a rock is much longer. But, be that as it may, the experience we have is that it's indifferent. And Levinas talks, about introducing responsibility as a non-indifference, as opposed to the unruliness or the anarchy without rule of the potential elemental view from our perspective. And then this leads him to a discussion, again, just following the discussion as Levinas takes it, not proposing it, just, it's a kind of mapping of what's taking place there, to substitution, the discussion of substitution of the one for the other, or the gestation of the other in the same. And this is for him this idea of substitution is coordinated with ego. Because in the ego, you think of yourself as unique and alone, and it's just me. But what he says is that from a perspective of responsibility, one has to come to understand that the ego is actually a substitution for something else. And this leads him to the final discussion, which is behind the starting place, behind this agency which recognized itself as an ego and in a world and in dwelling and in enjoyment and in signification and having a face. And behind this ego, Levinas says, is persecution. From a discussion of responsibility is persecution, and he has a series of terms here that are going to seem surprising, perhaps at first. That I am in fact a hostage. I am not in the nominative case, but I'm in the accusative case. I've been always a victim of assignation. I've experienced trauma, and I'm experiencing wound. These are all things that for Levinas are hidden behind what we identify ourselves as when we identify ourselves as ego. And he's not talking about, again, about a particular event, but in some sense he wants to argue that social relations confer upon us this status as a hostage, as in the accusative, as in assignation, as in trauma, as in wound, and as in persecution. Anyway, just a simple mapping, just a laying out of the territory for the moment, for otherwise empty. So I want to now begin to move to what will be the mainstay. I'm going to actually move to take a glass of water. Then I want to begin now to move to the mainstay of this interaction that we're having. And the mainstay will be the relationship to literature. And I have to say right away, and those of you who are following this will immediately, if you have any experience with reading Levinas, will know this, that Levinas unquestionably is against literature in certain capacities. An article that he wrote, very famous article, collected in numerous places. I think I've seen at least 3 translations of it in the collection, called Reality and its Shadow. I think the title is Reality and its Shadow. But he's basically saying that art, understood aesthetically, is simply evasion or irresponsibility, which is a very strange thing to say. And there have been numerous essays written about that idea. Richard Cohen wrote one, I wrote one, other individuals have written. One individual wrote a whole book on that particular essay, Reality and its Shadow. And what it's about, the shadow, is a reference, of course, to Plato. And what Levinas is arguing is that art, insofar as art is always, for him, art that's focused upon the artistic and upon the aesthetic ceases, the sensory ceases, is always a move away from responsibility. Responsibility for him is a form of non-indifference, and he's going to define responsibility as I'll give it again. All these Levinasian words are kind of funny words when you first hear them. Disinterestedness. To disinter is to unbury, and Levinas thinks that a normal way of proceeding as we move from, in Heidegger's account of being, from ego to the other as a version of the same, is a form of burying what's behind it. What's behind it is our infinite obligation for Levinas to the other human being, and this infinite obligation when we recognize responsibility, what we're doing is unburying. So it's disinter. To disinter means to raise up from the buried. But it's interested. It's buried in being. And the problem that Levinas has with Heidegger is that Heidegger sees being as fundamental, and he says Levinas says we need to remove ourselves, disinter ourselves from this being, from this estedness. Est is the Latin form of the word to be, and so we're buried in being, and in fact Heidegger is quite overt about what Heidegger names as phrase that he borrows from Leibniz called the conatus essendi. The conatus essendi is the perseverance in being, or perseverance in being, the pursuit of being sometimes. Okay? And Levinas is going to substitute for this pursuit in being what is sometimes referred to as loving the other. And what he means by that, it's a funny way of talking. What he means by that is it's a reference to Deuteronomy, and Deuteronomy is often quoted, is often translated as love the other as yourself. And Levinas will say it's not a matter of loving the other in the way that you love yourself, but it's loving the other in place of loving yourself. So loving the other is yourself, not loving the other as yourself, but loving the other is yourself. Or it's loving the other as yourself insofar as means is there. It's not presupposing that as you love yourself, so love others, because that is what leads you, or what constrains you within an egological perspective. But to break out of that, we have to reverse that polarity and begin with loving the other as the self, and then from that heteronomy. It's not an autonomy, but a heteronomy. The word hetero, of course, in Greek means the other. So we're not autonomous individuals. We're heteronomous individuals, which means that heteronomy is really the relationship that is primary in what he's calling this phenomenology of sociality. That social, in terms of sociality, we are only at home when we're with others, and with others in the relationship of extension, or this gestation that I mentioned to you. These are all hard things to put together because we don't normally keep these in place. We tend to think in terms of an egological or egoic perspective. Okay, so Levinas reviews literature or art as potentially an evasion of responsibility, which is not a good thing for him. I mean, we can do it, but it's just like, it's a form of self-entertainment or self-indulgence to a certain extent. But what he wants to do is move away from that self-indulgence. And so what I would like to do now is to turn to his second idea about literature, after the first idea about literature, which is that aesthetic literature is evasion. And he says there are certain circumstances, and he says this isn't reality and it's shadow. And this is what Richard Cohen and I and other people have noticed about this, that in certain kinds of literature, the artist gives up being an artist and begins to be a philosopher. He begins to be Levinas in some ways. And so he thinks of that activity as what Shakespeare, this is going to come up in Ethics and Affinity, as Shakespeare does that. And Molière does that, and Sophocles does that, and Euripides does that, Dostoevsky does that. And so when they do that, they're not simply presenting art. They're presenting what Levinas would think of as genuine philosophy. They're becoming philosophers. And to do that means to turn against their art as artists, in some sense, for art to become itself self-reflexive, for art to become about art, or art to become about aesthetics. And so that this anti-aesthetic art is what he would think of. He doesn't give a name to it. I've written about this myself, and what we call we think of as great literature, or the not just simply better, but quantitatively more important than others, historically more important in the sense of more people have turned to Shakespeare than turned to other Elizabethan writers, for example. And it's not simply because he happens to be, it's not random that he happens to be considered better, but from a Levinasian perspective, because he's self-reflexive about what it is that others are doing, that he has in common. And as you think, it's thinking about being an artist, or being a dramatic writer, or being a novelist. That's important for Levinas. And so Levinas will write about what I've called, and just adopted the traditional notion of great literature, and that this literary writing, the writing of Shakespeare, the writing of Dostoevsky, the writing of Sophocles, the writing of Euripides, becomes a way that acts as commentary. And so when we tend to think of literature as really art, and we are the critics reading literature from the outside, it's really literature that's reading us. And so it's literature that's doing the reading. And what we need to do, from a Levinasian point of view, is learn to read from literature, not to read literature, but to read from literature. And Levinas will apply the same reading technique to scripture, to biblical scripture. And we need to learn to, he said the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, and for him, the Christian Bible as well, is reading us, is reading its words. We need to read the Bible's reading, rather than read the Bible as if we're standing outside and we make judgments about the Bible, we need to read the Bible's reading and understand how the Bible is reading our culture and us as readers. Okay, do we have, maybe this is a good point for us to take the questions. I think we're probably almost up to an hour at this point. And maybe we take some questions, do you think? And then what we'll start to do is we'll put up some pages of ethics and infinity and just kind of go through these chapters where these themes are taken up.
Just a remark for the audience. If you have any questions, please raise your hand and we will let you give a question. For me, it was very interesting to listen to your layout of the ideas of Levinas, and for me there's a question that heteronomy as opposite to autonomy.
Yes.
And in healthcare, we usually focus on autonomy. Autonomy is one of the main bioethical principles,
right.
And that means that, to respect another person, to respect patient, it's respectful. Respect is to take into account his will and not to intervene someone's will, and allow someone to act as an autonomous person. Just the other makes final decisions, or just all decisions based on information you provide to them. Does this concept of autonomy in medical area, could it be replaced by heteronomy? How it would look like?
I understand what you're saying as a form of radical respect for the other individual and for their capacity to make decisions and to exercise freedom from within their own framework. Heteronomy, for him, is not something that we should be after, but that is already what's going on when we say autonomy. We say autonomy, but in fact we're always operating from the perspective of others. In some sense, we need to encourage the capacity for people to respect themselves by virtue of Levinas. I'm not arguing this, but again, describing the Levinasian position. By arguing that respecting the radical alterity of other people is extremely important. Radical alterity is one of the fundamental ideas of totalitarianism. In a totalitarian context, the other is not radical, the other is simply an extension of the same. And so to give the other respect is extremely important and is in line with his account that we tend to think of ourselves as autonomous when in fact we are without acknowledging it heteronomous individuals.
Okay, but for example, a patient who is asking for treatment methods that are not beneficial, or maybe refusing therapy that is not that is vital for him or her. The other is radically different, and for example, we as health professionals probably wouldn't go that way. The patient is going, but the principle of autonomy requires us to, let's say, follow someone's wish to discontinue treatment, even if that might cause a death of someone. So, would that be within the concept of Levinas, or maybe the autonomy relationship between health professional and patient? Or should we just follow the autonomy? We say, okay, these are our decisions, and I don't care.
My own impression would be that it's situational, and that what a Levinasian approach would be resisting of totalitarianism, of any entrance of totalitarian thinking, and that or dictatorial thinking of what the patient should do. I mean, to imagine a situation in which the government says, well, if our doctors say that you have to lose your finger because of this, that, or the other thing, then you will lose your finger. I mean, that would not be Levinasian. Would require respecting the alterity of the other and the others, rather than imposing the version of the same, of the logic of the egoic agency. So what would be Levinasian would be not imposing anything that's egological, either, not ecological, but ego with a G, egological, whether it's governmental or individual to adopt it, but being respectful of the freedom, the freedom of the possibility of not doing, of choosing to not do. I think for Levinas, freedom is always a negative term. It's not a version of doing, but it's a version of not doing. To be free is to free yourself from the doings that are always already taking place. We're never not doing something. And so freedom is a way of learning to not do, and to learn to take off the shackles. And then what we choose to do is another discussion. But the activity of freedom, which I think needs to be, from a Levinasian point of view, would argue for respecting, would be freedom to not do. The freedom to take a Sabbath. The freedom to stop. The freedom to give up this incessance. The freedom to stop.
Like allowing other person be just other.
Allow the other person to be other. Yeah. Would be my own guess. I've never seen Levinas talk specifically about that case, but that would be my own guess of what a Levinasian perspective might be. Okay, should we start to? Yeah. Okay. Good. So let's, I guess, put up the first chapter of this 10-chapter book that we're going to look at now today in our second hour of discussion. These are 10 chapters. This would be a chapter on the Bible and philosophy. And if you look at this page 21, which I think is what we have up there, and I do recommend reading Richard Cohen's fine introduction to this. He's the translator of this book. This is a collection of conversations between Philippe Nemo and Emmanuel Levinas that I believe, if I'm not mistaken, were shown on French TV. Yeah? And so this tends to be more user-friendly than is commonly identified with Levinas. So on page 21, Philippe Nemo asks, how does one begin thinking? This is the opening. How does one begin thinking? And through the questions one poses to and of yourself, following occurrences, or through the thoughts and works with which one first enters into contact. And Levinas says it probably begins through traumatisms. And I think that's extremely important for Levinas, that for him, as for Freud, trauma really is at the start, or disaster is at the start of responsibility. And think of the word responsibility as an ability to respond. Yeah, but respond to what means there's something that needs a response. It's asking for a response. And so trauma is, I think this is commonly known, that trauma is not simply an injury that occurs, but it's something that occurs that also affects the capacity to register that it's occurring. So it's not simply an occurrence of, like I hurt my finger, it's not trauma. But that it's something that, when you go through, you're in a horrible car accident, you go through the window, we don't have the capacity to register the fact that we're going through, the glass is going in and out, and in and out, in and out of our bodies. We have the effects, so we block out in our minds the whole experience just before and just after. And it's just like it's known as, sometimes referred to as the black box. And he's saying here that to some extent thinking itself begins in trauma. And I've always myself understood literature as written from the context of trauma. So I'm going to assume we may not always be able to identify what traumatic event produced what consequence. But when we look at Shakespeare's Othello, when we look at Sophocles' Oedipus or Euripides' Bacchae, I'm assuming either in the personal lives of these writers or in the cultural lives, there's something traumatic that's taking place that has urged on this thinking. One does not even know how to give a verbal form. It's a separation, it's a violent scene, he says, and it is from the reading of books and not necessarily philosophical books that these initial shocks become questions, become problems, giving one a need to think. All right, and then we'll move on to the next page, which is 22 and 23. In this sense, the Bible would be, for me, the book par excellence. In other words, the Bible, we tend not to think of this. The Bible is a book of trauma. It's a book about response to trauma. And so, for Levinas, you can understand how responsibility would be built in to the notion of biblical scripture. And that one way of approaching biblical scripture would be to try to find the ways in which the Bible is doing its modalities of responding to trauma. How is the Bible responding to trauma? And then Philippe Nemo asks about some great books. What thus have been for you the first great books, and very early in the Bible? I mean, as a biblical reader, the first philosophic text at the university after easy survey of psychology and secondary school and so forth, which I guess may have taken place here in Cohen's secondary school. And a rapid reading of some pages from philosophic idealism and an introduction to philosophy. But between the Bible and the philosophers, the Russian classics, Pushkin and Lermontov, and Gogol, and Turgenev, and Dostoevsky, and Tolstoy, these are the writers that Levinas finds his own writers. And also the great writers of the Western European tradition, notably Shakespeare, much admired Hamlet and Macbeth and Lear. And I remember giving a lecture here in the Lear lecture. Yeah, last year, last November. Philosophic problem understood as the meaning of the human. And for Levinas, that becomes extremely important. Levinas says that what he's doing is charting the breakthrough of the human from social categories and social forms. And when he's asked in one of his final interviews in a collection of that was just read in the Levinas Center called Entre Nous, Levinas was asked, "What is important for you?" And he says, "What's important for me, what I'm working on right now is something he calls the deformalization of time. Deformalization of time. And what does that mean? It means, we'll explain it as we go, but what it means is the breakthrough of the human. That the human time is a way of giving us measurement and giving us some grounding. And we can stand here and here and here, but not there and not there. We can have these. It's a way of giving us some measurement. But the human is something somehow excluded when we do that, potentially excluded. And so he wants to introduce the human and find the place for the breakthrough of the human. And it seems to me that he's saying these writers allow us to think the human. And one thinks of King Lear and King Lear as as doing something that forces his daughter to leave the kingdom and then forces him to live in a very strange way with two daughters who then throw him out on the barren land, and then he eventually will die by virtue of these actions, because he's not in some sense taking into account the human. He's putting it aside. The philosophic problem understood as the meaning of the human, as the search for the famous meaning of life, about which the characters of the Russian novels ceaselessly wonder. It's a good preparation for Plato and Kant. Registered in the degree program of philosophy, but it takes time to see that transition. So how have you been harmonized these modes of thought? Well, were they supposed to harmonize? I didn't, it's my respect for books. Again, there's the notion of respect. That is a Levinasian notion. It consumes much more in respect for books, the Bible, and traditional commentaries, than in deterministic belief. So it's not about belief for Levinas. It's about respect. About what's already respect for what's already taken place. I did not mean that this was an attenuated religious sentiment. The Bible, that the sentiment that the Bible is the book of books, wherein the first things are said that became said, so that human life has a meaning, and are said in a form which opens to commentators the same form, was not some simple substitution of literary judgment. It's that extraordinary presence of its characters in the ethical plenitude and its mysterious possibilities of exegesis. So the Bible is itself already a possibility of exegesis. It's already a commentary. It's already a critical thinking. The extent to which the Bible and literature is itself already critical thinking, which we get from close reading of these texts. That is what's very, very important for Levinas. The text of the great philosophers, with a place of interpretation, holds in their reading, seems to me closer to the Bible than opposed to it. Okay, let's go on to the next page, 24, 25. We can indeed, Philippe Nemo still wants to come talk about harmonizing, and then Levinas is getting a little bit mature. He says, I have never aimed explicitly to harmonize or conciliate these traditions, if they happen to be in harmony, probably because every philosophic thought rests on a pre-philosophic experience. Okay. And then we'll skip a little bit to the next question. Let's come to that tradition. Who are the first philosophers that you read? And then even before beginning my studies, he says on page 25, I've serious contact with specifically philosophical literature with Strasbourg. And then there at 18, I met 4 professors, Blondel, Holbachs, Pradin, and Carteret. And there's a note on that. We'll go to the next page here, which I guess is 26, 27. And then we'll skip to Philippe Nemo's question. Do you put the sociological thought of Durkheim on the same level? Now we're going to get to this discussion of Durkheim. And apparently Durkheim was inaugurating an experimental sociology. There's what I was saying to you as the socialité. But his work also appeared as rational sociology and his elaboration of the fundamental categories of the social as what would today be called an eidetic of society, beginning with the leading idea that the social does not reduce to the sum of individual psychology. And that's what I was trying to say to you before. The sacred or the social or the symbolic, which are roughly synonymous in Durkheim, do not reduce to individual elements that make up those categories. To Durkheim, as a metaphysician, in a certain way, the idea that the social is very order of the spiritual, a new plot in being, above animal and human psychism, the level of collective representations defined with vigor and which opens the dimension of spirit in the individual life. In Durkheim, there is, in a sense, a theory of levels of being, of the irreducibility of these levels to one another, an idea which acquires its full meaning within Husserlian and Heideggerian context, which is what he's going to talk about next. And then he says, you likewise mention Bergson. And Bergson is extremely important for us, for the notion of duration, what's translated here as duration. The French for that is la durée, la durée. And so duration is not exactly the same thing as la durée. I mean, la durée would be, I think, closer to something like, it's the past verb form. It would be something like the endured. But duration, what does he mean by duration? And we use that notion of duration to define in another essay something he calls diachrony. And diachrony is, again, I'm going to be doing this as I go through this, trying to give you, it's a general introduction to Levinas. Diachrony is simply our experience of moments, but before they're measured in relationship to each other, just the experience of moments in and of themselves. So radical duration, duration itself. What is duration itself? We tend to think of duration as between this point and that point. Okay, so what is duration apart from the between? What is it in itself without those endpoints? That's kind of what he's getting at, and saying that we have these experiences. He's going to try to, in some sense, give names to these experiences that we only define by endpoints that are not those experiences. He will subsequently define something in one of his next chapters called the Ilia, which is what he calls the ground of being. It's similar to duration. In any case, he introduces the notion of duration here, and he says the destruction of the primacy of clock time, the idea that the time of physics is merely derived. Without this affirmation, the somehow ontological and not merely psychological priority of duration, irreducible to linear and homogeneous time, Heidegger would not have been able to write. In other essays, he calls this notion of duration the meanwhile. Meanwhile, what is meanwhile? Where is meanwhile? How is meanwhile between this and that? Meanwhile. Okay, but where is it? What is it? It's what he calls duration, as he says, Bergson uses. Heidegger would not have been possible if it weren't for this ocean of duration, which he feels is linked to his concept of Dasein, being there. The credit goes back to Bergson for having liberated philosophy from the prestigious model of scientific time. And that will stay with him. Levinas is going to continue. The deformalization of time will be his project here, and will be his project in the very last interview he gives. So he never gave up on that project. What would be an example of a deformalization of time? He actually gives one. The example he gives in that later interview is from Rosenzweig, Franz Rosenzweig. And Franz Rosenzweig has this idea of creation, revelation, and redemption. But they're not simply parallel to past, present, and future. Because creation is a version for Rosenzweig of the infinite within the finite. Creation is the occurrence of in Rosenzweig, God, the divine, the unconditioned, the infinite, entering into the finite and bringing things about, making things happen. But then revelation is the revelation of creation. So it's linked. It's not simply the present as opposed to the past. If you have the present, it's different from the past in our normal way of thinking of time. And the present is different from the future in our normal way of thinking of time. So that's our formalization of time. We have a present that is not the future and it's not the past. But in creation, revelation, redemption, revelation is the revelation of creations, intimately linked to creation. And redemption is the future redemption of this revealed creation. And so our link is wondering if there are other ways of moving out of this formalization of time that we have always thought of as a way of proceeding. And it seems to me, without getting into the examples, to have medical applications of this. Okay, but to what more personal question, this I guess wasn't satisfying to Philippe Nemo. What more personal issues are here? Certainly to the fear of, this is 28, the fear of being in a world without novel possibilities. I'm going to skip a little bit of this. And then he's going to talk about having moved from Strasbourg to work with Husserl and beginning to be interested in Husserl's work. And he thinks of Husserl as, this is the top of 29, the impression was at once of opening and method, the sentiment of suitability and legitimacy of the questioning and philosophic inquiry which one would want to follow without leaving ranks. The formulation of philosophy as a rigorous science was without doubt the first attraction of this of Husserl's message. And so it's the possibility of doing something that's both scientific and is also philosophical at the same time. And Levinas thinks of that as possible. There's something valid and for Levinas demonstrable about certain of the insights that he has. And Husserl is developing that within the context of something that Husserl calls phenomenology. And phenomenology, again, is this notion of intentionalities. That's the word, the phrase. That is the phrase that is used, intentionalities, by Levinas with regard to Husserl. Okay, so how did you enter into contact with Husserl? Nemo asks, and it was an accident. And he describes it here. I'm going to skip this a little bit. And then we go to page 30. Little by little, the essential truth of Husserl, which I still believe today, had emerged in my mind. First place, there is the possibility, sich zu besinnen, of grasping oneself or of getting back to oneself and posing with distinction the questions, where are we, of taking one's bearings. And in some ways, that's what this chart was about. It's taking one's bearings, not simply living, but living in a way that takes one account of living. The fact that one is living, that is self-reflective. It's not simply conscious, but conscious of itself, self-conscious. Taking one's bearings. And perhaps this is phenomenology. He was very clear about this. Again, I'm just presenting what it is that this is a book that tries to go through pretty much all of Levinas, and so it seemed to be a good introduction this week to give us as a way of beginning to think about how Levinas could work for us here. Phenomenology, he says in the middle of page 30, is the recall of these forgotten thoughts, of these intentions, a full consciousness returned to the misunderstood implied intentions of thought in the world. So intentions are in the sense that Levinas is using, it's not simply ideas about what I would like to do, but it's plans for actions, agendas. Intentions are, what are my agendas? As Levinas is reading Husserl, he's saying that it's a philosophy of agendas, of performance of actions that are undertaken, or failed to undertake, or forgotten. It says, it is the presence of the philosopher near to things without the illusion or rhetoric in their true statement, precisely clarifying the meaning of their objectivity. And on top of 31, there being not answering only to the question of knowing what is, but to the question, how is what is? What does it mean that it is? Recalling the obscure intentions of thought, methodology, and phenomenological work is also at the origin of some ideas, seems to me indispensable to all philosophical analysis. The new vigor given to the medieval idea of intentionality of consciousness. All consciousness is consciousness of something. It's not describable without reference to the object that it claims. So to describe consciousness is the phenomenological goal, is to describe these intentionalities, these agendas of consciousness. The intentional aim, which is not knowledge, but which in sentiments or aspirations, in its very dynamism, is qualified effectively or actively. This is the first radical contestation in Western thought of the priority of the theoretical, which Heidegger is going to come to. All right, feeling in order for us to move on. Turn to page 32, and it says, you forget the importance in Husserl of axiological intentionality. And there, I've been saying that. That's what he says there. Axiological, top 32. Axiological intentionality. That is your path. Did you know Husserl? I audited his lectures at Fribourg. He had just retired, but still taught, and I was able to approach him, and he received me amicably. Okay, so let's go now to Heidegger very briefly. Heidegger is page 37. Is there any way we can make this any bigger? So are you able to read?
Yeah.
You can. Okay, good. Okay. All right. So Heidegger, then Levinas says, When he came to Freiburg, Nemo asked him, follow Husserl, he discovered there a philosopher he did not know beforehand, Martin Heidegger. I discovered, in fact, Sein and Zeit, which people around me read. Very early, I had a great admiration for this book. It's one of the finest books in history. He never gives up that idea. You know, he says that one has to go through Heidegger, not around or without or ignoring Heidegger, but through Heidegger, beyond Heidegger, he says, beyond fundamental ontology, but not ignoring Heidegger, through it. I say this after years of reflection, one of the finest among 4 or 5 others. That said, you know, which others? You know, the Phaedra, Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, Hegel's Phenomenology of Mind, Bergson's Time and Free Will. My admiration for Heidegger is above all an admiration for Sein and Zeit. I always try to relive the ambience of those readings, which when in 1933 was unthinkable. It was before Heidegger became the rector of the university in Germany. One speaks habitually of the word as if it were a substantive or being, even though it is a verb. And there it is, that idea that being is a verb. In French, we say the being, l'être, le être, l'être, or un être. With Heidegger, verbality was awkward in the word being. What is event in it? What is the happening of being? The action. It is as if things and all that is set a style of being, made a profession of being. Heidegger has accustomed us to this verbal sonority. This re-education of our ears is unforgettable for Levinas, even if banal today. Philosophy would thus have been an attempt to answer the question of the signification of being as a verb. While Husserl still proposed, or seemed to propose, a transcendental program for philosophy, Heidegger clearly defined philosophy in relationship to fundamental ontology. Fundamental being. What is the ontology? What is ontology in this context? Well, it's the verb to be. Ontology would be distinguished from all the disciplines which explore that which is. We're going to shift over to 31 here. Sein and Zeit appeared in 27. Was this a way of presenting the task of philosophy absent novelty? That is, in any case, the impression that I am reading. The work that I did then on the theory of intuition was thus influenced by Heidegger, which came afterwards, Sein and Zeit, to the extent that I sought to present Husserl as having perceived the ontological problem of being, the question of the status rather than of the quiddity, the whatness of being. Phenomenological analysis, I said, in searching for the constitution of the real for consciousness, does not undertake so much to search for transcendental conditions. That's not what Levinas is doing. And he's setting aside this Husserlian desire for transcendental conditions. In the idealist sense of the term, does not wonder about the signification of the being of beings, diverse. It's just simply registering the beings as an action. In Sein and Zeit, analysis of anxiety, care, being towards death, we witness a sovereign exercise of phenomenology. This exercise is extremely brilliant and convincing, Levinas is right. So he never gives up this idea. He remains, to some extent, still Heideggerian. It aims at describing man's being or existence, not his nature. This is not about nature, but about the verbality of being. What has been called existentialism has certainly determined by Sein and Zeit. Heidegger did not like anyone to give his book this existential signification. Human existence interested him only as the place of fundamental ontology. Analysis of the extent of existence done in this book has marked and determined the analysis called existentialism. All right. What struck you, especially in Heidegger? Intentionality. Okay, I'm going to skip some of this because we're repeating what we said. I do want to try to move on. So this is about the great model. Sein and Zeit, the model of ontology. He says, but I think later work of Heidegger does not produce in me, but in us, a comparable impression. Remains valuable only through Sein and Zeit. Not, you well know that it is insignificant, but in much less convincing words than the Heidegger's subsequent political engagements. I've never forgotten those engagements, and though Heidegger has never been exculpated in my eyes from his participation in national socialism. All right, so page 42. Perhaps, well, I guess, bottom of 41, Nemo asks, what way the second part of the Heideggerian work does it point you? Perhaps the disappearance of phenomenology, properly speaking, is moving into something else. Language does not have this original importance for you. In fact, for me, the said, the D, does not count as much as the saying, the deal. The deal rated D in French is what he's talking about. The said and the saying. The saying is the deal. Literally, the to say. The deal, the to say. The latter, the to say, is important to me less through its informational comments that, or contents than by the fact that it is addressed to an interlocutor, to a person. It's the breakthrough of the human. It's the practice of the ethical. Saying, as language as saying, is the practice of the ethical. But we still speak about this again. We will speak about this again. I think, despite these reservations, that a man who undertakes to philosophize in the 20th century cannot have gone through Heidegger's philosophy even to escape it. This thought is a great event of our century. He keeps talking about how important Heidegger's thinking is in Sein and Sein. We say of Heidegger, of all things being equal otherwise, that what Sartre said of Marxism. Well, there are many things for which I cannot still pardon Marx, he says. So he's not really a Marxist. But what concerns Heidegger, one cannot, in fact, ignore fundamental ontology. And it's problematic, which is what he will give. But he's going to still go beyond the fundamental ontology, because he's going to introduce ethics as first philosophy, not fundamental ontology. It's ethics that will be fundamental. All right, so let's move on to 3, and now we move to his book. How are we doing? We have a half hour, I think. So maybe we're going to have to move a little more quickly through these. Okay. So to begin, you were an historian of philosophy, or an analyst of philosophers, and then you come up with a book called Existence and Existence, and that's what this chapter is about. And it says it deals with something I call the Iliad, the there is. I did not know Apollinaire had written a work entitled There Is, but for him, the expression signifies the joy of what exists, the abundance, a little like Heidegger's essendi. For me, it is to the contrary, there is. It is to the contrary. For me, it's to the contrary. There is the phenomenon of impersonal being. It. He says at one point, I don't think he says it here, but he says at one point, when you've been away from a city and you come back and you see it for the first time, when you return first time in a long time, it has this sense of there it is, it's there. It doesn't have the charge that you've had because you've been away from it and you've forgotten and you put it aside. And it's simply there. And that's the sense of the there is. It's there. It's the ground of being. But it's not nothing. It's somehow, in the book Existence and Existence, he says, Heidegger insists that there's only being or nothing. And he says there's this thing between being and nothing, that there is, the ground of being. There is. And he says it's like holding up a shell to your ear, and you're hearing nothing, but the nothing that you're hearing is something. It's not really nothing. You say nothing. You hear nothing, but it's really something you're hearing. I've recently, become a kind of a devotee of podcasts about cosmology, with the James Webb Telescope and all. And they say, more and more cosmologists say, we think of places as vacuums. They're not really vacuums. There's stuff going on everywhere. And there's motion always. There's no such thing as nothing. At least that's what cosmologists begin to say. The idea of nothing doesn't exist. You can have a ground, maybe. There's the there-ness of it, and maybe that's what Heidegger was at. But it's not really nothing. So it's not universe from nothing, but maybe universe from a ground up or something like that. And another point in this book, he actually will say he will link the there is to responsibility. He said one of the reasons I thought of responsibility is so important, and I thought of it already in this book. I didn't articulate it in this book, but I articulated it later on in Otherwise Than Being. One of the reasons I thought about it is that as a responsibility is a response to the there is. To the there. He says it's a rumbling sound. One sleeps alone. The adults continue life. The child feels the silence of his bedroom as a rumbling. It is something resembling what one hears when one puts an empty shell close to the ear, as if the emptiness were full, as if silence were a noise. It's something that one can also feel when one thinks that even if there is nothing. One thinks that even if there is nothing, the fact that there is undeniable. Not that there is this or that, but the very scene of being is open. There is, in the absolute emptiness that one can imagine before creation, there is. And in fact, in the Rashi translation of Hebrew Bible, there's a brief moment, very brief moment of before creation. It says, when God set about to create the heavens and the earth being unformed and void, darkness upon the face of the deep, Spirit of God hovering over the face of the earth. Then, here's what happened. God said, let there be light. So you have the condition. There's a darkness, there's God hovering over the face of the waters. Because the earth that's void and utterly empty. Tohu vabohu. So there is. A moment ago, you said you evoked the German as Gift. The German there is, and now this is Heidegger made of it. For you, on the other hand, there is no generosity in there is. I insist, Levinas says, on the impersonality of the there is. There is as in it rains or it's night. What is the it that is night? It's night. It is night. So it's impersonal. I sometimes use the expression it's the excluded middle. It's the excluded middle. One cannot say of the there is, which persists, that it is an event of being. One can neither say that it is nothingness, even though there is nothing. Even though there is nothing. Existence and existence tries to describe this horrible thing. What it is horrible. We experience it. We actually experience it because we want to cling to things. We experience it, he says in that book, as horrible. This horrible thing. And moreover describes it as horror and panic. The child on his bed senses night dragging on, has an experience of horror, which nevertheless is not anxiety. The book appeared with a wrapper where I had inscribed, where it is not a question of anxiety. Everyone began to speak a lot about anxiety in Paris in 1947. All right, so I'm going to, again, because of time elements, I'm going to move quickly. That's basically what he has said about there is, and then he turns to Blanchot. You mean to say that in Blanchot's work, this is page 30, it's no longer being and no longer something. It's always necessary to unsay what one says, and it is the event which is neither being nor nothingness. So he says Blanchot is a good writer of the there is. Explains into the there is. And then in the short book of 1947, it says, of which we are now speaking, as in that which followed under the title Time and the Other in 48, the ideas to which I hold today are still sought. A good many of the intuitions arise, which mark a distance covered rather than an ending. What is presented as exigency is an attempt to escape the there is. And for him, the attempt to escape the there is, again, will manifest itself as responsibility. That's why one of the reasons I think it's important to have a sense of this. I analyzed other modalities of being taken in its verbal sense: fatigue, indolence, effort. In these phenomena, I showed a dread before being, an impotent recoil from being, an evasion of being, and consequently, there too, the shadow of the there is. What was the solution you have prepared? Well, my first idea was that perhaps a being or something one could point out with a finger corresponds to a mastery over the there is. I spoke thus of the determinate being where existed the dawn of authority in the horror of there is. Does one not say that the table is, that things are, and then one refastens being to the existent? And I spoke thus of the hypostasis of existence. Look, remember the chart that we put up. It had used the word hypostasis. The hypostasis of existence, That is, the passage going from being to something, and from the state of a verb to the state of thing. Being, which is posited, I think, but is saved. So that was an early thought. But he's going to come to some other idea, and so at the very end of it, he says, the ego that exists is encumbered by, and so now we move to page, from page 51 to page 52, it's encumbered by these existence, by all existence that it dominates. For me, the famous Heideggerian care took the form of encumbrance, from whence an entirely different movement to escape the there is. And here's where it gets to this idea. One must not be posed, but deposed. To make an act of deposition, in a sense one speaks of deposed kings. This deposition of sovereignty by the ego is the social relationship. And that's going to be this egoic discovery that there's another behind the other that I imagine, the other which introduces notions of persecution and wound, all these other things. And this deposition of sovereignty by the ego is the social relationship with the other, with a capital O, which means it's the autrui, the other person. And here's where he calls it the disinterested relationship, the disinterested. And I write it in 3 words to underline the escape from being that it signifies. I distrust the compromised word of love, but responsibility for the other, being for the other, seemed to me as early as that time to stop the anonymous and senseless grumbling of being. There it is. There it is. That's why it's important that we read this chapter. It is in the form of such a relation that the deliverance from the there is appeared to me. Since that compelled my recognition was clarified to my mind, I've hardly spoken again in my books of the there is for itself, but the shadow of the there is and of nonsense still appeared to me as the very text of the disinterestedness. What do you want to do? We have just about 15 minutes or so. I'm tempted to skip a couple of chapters of this and move maybe right to the chapter on responsibility, the face of responsibility. Does that seem like a reasonable thing to do? What do you think?
Okay. Yeah, let's move.
Yeah, I mean, this is available, and again, I think we decided we are going to make this digitally available because we took this right from the web. This is available. We're not doing anything that's in no way illegal. It's on the web. You can go to Monoscope and download this, which is what I did, and it's just available on the web and perfectly acceptable. I don't know. I know that we can do it, and it's done, and I've been told by a lawyer that it's not illegal to do. So, but I don't know why. I can't explain the details of it. But anyway, but in other words, or you go out, of course, and buy a copy of Ethics and Infinity and read these intervening chapters, which I think would be certainly worth doing. So it's a way of escaping the solitude of being, which is at root the there is that Levinas is writing. So I think what I'm going to do at this point is I'm going to move to I'm going to move past 6, and move to the face and the responsibility for the other, and then we'll talk about testimony and the prophetic. I think that'll take us to speech. This would be on page 85. Page 80. Good 85. In totality and infinity, you speak at great length of the face, which is one of your frequent themes. What does this phenomenology of the face, that is analysis of what happens? Again, phenomenology is always analysis of what happens. When I look at the other face, when I look at the other face to face, what is consistent and what is its purpose? I do not know if one can speak of a phenomenology of the face, since the face describes what appears. So, since phenomenology describes what appears, but the face doesn't appear, it reflects what it's seeing. The face is the same, and it says at some point, it says in this book later, the face, what it says is, "Thou shalt not kill." The face is the commandment to not kill, the 6th commandment. I did not know if one could speak of phenomenology of the face, since phenomenology describes what appears. So, too, I wonder if one can speak of a look turn towards the face. For the look is knowledge, perception. I think rather that access to the face is straight away ethical. So it's our gateway. You use the other elsewhere. You use the word gateway. You turn yourself towards the other as towards an object. When you see a nose, eyes, a forehead, a chin, you can describe them. The best way of encountering the other is not even to notice the color of the eyes. When one observes the color of the eyes, one is not in social relationship to the other. So I think immediately of the medical context, because it's to some extent a doctor's obligation to look at those details, which means the details that take you away from it as a person and move you towards an object. So this is, in some sense, to look at the face of the other is a tough thing for a doctor to do, because it goes against the grain of what a doctor presumably, right, is trained to do, which is to look at things that one doesn't normally look at. Where one observes the color of the eyes and is not in the social relationship. The relation with the face can surely be dominated by perception, but what is specifically the face is what cannot be reduced to that, to sensations. There is first the very uprightness of the face. It's upright exposure without defense. He says the face is nakedness. The face is defenselessness. The face is utter vulnerability, so he says. The skin of the face is what is most naked, most destitute. The face is destitution. It is most naked through decent nudity, though a decent nudity is the most destitute. The face is exposed, it's menaced, as if inviting us to an act of violence. At the same time, the face is what forbids us to kill. It was saying, thou shalt not kill. War stories tell us the fact that it's difficult to kill someone who looks at you. The face is signification, and signification without context. He calls it sometimes signifyingness itself. Funny phrase, right, in English. Signifyingness itself. I mean that the other in rectitude, capital O, in the rectitude of the face, is not a character within a context. Ordinarily, one is a character, a professor, Sorbonne, Supreme Court Justice, son of so-and-so, everything that is in one's passport. The manner of dressing, presenting oneself, all of that has signification in such a context. The meaning of something is its relationship to another thing. Here, to the contrary, the face is meaning all by itself. You are you. So maybe one way that the doctor can gain access to the human is through the capacity for briefly and temporarily to set aside the observations of the eye color and the motion, and to look at the face, to engage somehow the face to face. Maybe he's offering a way to do that. Let me also say this, because we're going to get to, and I don't want to lose this idea, that for Levinas, there's going to be three responsibilities, what I think of as the three R's. There's a responsibility one has to the other. There's a responsibility one has to the other's responsibility. So, for example, a parent has a responsibility for the child's responsibility. And there's a responsibility that he says at the very end of this book to the death of the other. And that's where the medical, for a long time I wondered, how is that actualized, the responsibility of the other's death? And the medical situation is perfectly simple of the potential, because the doctor has committed himself or herself to a responsibility for mortality to some extent, in some ways, in some context. A doctor is more commonly than others would be committed to the life and death. The face is signification of the heart, but here, you are you. In this sense, no one can say that the face is not seen. It is what cannot become content, which is your thought would embrace. It is uncontainable. It leads you beyond. It is this signification of the face that makes it escape from being a correlate of no vision. To the contrary, is a search for adequation. Vision, as opposed to seeing the face, is a search for what's adequate, what's fitting. Adequation. It is what par excellence. This is the reading from 87. It is what par excellence absorbs being, but the relation to the face is straightway ethical. The face is what cannot kill, or at least is that whose meaning consists in saying, thou shalt not kill. Murder, it is true, is a banal fact. One can kill the other. The ethical exigency is not an ontological necessity. The prohibition against killing does not render murder impossible, even if the authority of prohibition is maintained. It also appears in the scriptures, to which the humanity of man is exposed inasmuch as it is engaged in. But to speak truly, the appearance in being of these ethical peculiarities, the humanity of man, is a rupture of being. It's a breakthrough of the human. It is significant, even if being resumes and recovers itself. Okay, because we have, again, time, we'll move quickly through this. The bottom of 30 of 87, the face speaks. It's not vision, the face speaks. It is discourse, or more exactly, it is response or responsibility, which is this authentic relationship. But since, there's Nemo, but since the ethical, this is 88, the ethical relationship is beyond knowledge, it is authentically assumed through discourse. And then Levinas' answer is, in discourse, I have always distinguished, in fact, between the saying and the said. That the saying must bear a said is a necessity of the same order as that which imposes society with laws, institutions, social relations. But the saying is, in fact, that before the face, I do not simply remain there contemplating it. I respond to it, to the face. The saying is a way of reading the other. The face is a saying. It's a way of reading the other. But to read the other is already to answer for the other. It's difficult to be silent in one's presence. This difficulty has the ultimate foundation in this signification proper to the saying. Whatever it says. So you see the face, you recognize the face as face, is in some way, is already to engage responsibility for that other that you're engaging with. You may limit it right away, but you've already begun on the path of assuming some kind of responsibility. You see. It is necessary to speak of something, of the rain, the fine weather, no matter what, but to speak, to respond to him, and already to answer for him, which I think is really interesting. In the face of the other, you say there is an elevation or a height. The first word of the face is, thou shalt not kill. It is an order, a commandment in the appearance of the face. It is as if a master spoke to me. However, at the same time, the face of the other is destitute. It's the poor, for whom I can do all, and to whom I owe all. And me, whoever I may be, but as the first person, I am he who finds resources to respond to the call. One is tempted to say, Nemo writes, yes, in certain cases, but other cases, maybe no. Levinas, to be sure, but I think that whatever the motivation which explains this inversion, the analysis of the faces I've made with the other master, with the mastery of the other and his poverty, with my submission and my wealth is primary. It's presupposed in all human relationships. It is as if it is, if it were not that we would not even say before an open door, after you, sir. It is an original after you, sir, that I have tried to describe. I'm going to jump to responsibility now, because there's someone, I guess Steve Schenck is a critic and a poet. He says that when he met Levinas, or maybe he's just talking about reading Levinas, he said Levinas would always go around saying that responsibility is always the infinite after you, sir. And Levinas has written a book, written an essay called Prayer Without Demand. And prayer without demand is like saying, when we pray for something, we're not praying, playing, please give me this, that, he says, prayer without demand is like when you come to a door and two people are going to go through the door and you say, please, meaning after you. That please, I pray you, means after you. And he says, that's responsible. That's responsible. That's answering for you. That's responsible. Okay, that's prayer without demand. All right, so let's And then, but again, he's really I guess he's really raising the whole issue of human relationships here. Okay, I guess we did need to stay on 89 because he just comes right into responsibility here. 89, bottom of 89. You have spoken of the passion of hate. I feared a much graver objection. How is it that one can punish and repress? How is it that there is justice? And I answer that it is the fact of the multiplicity of human beings and the presence of someone else next to the other. So what is justice? Ethics is my relation of the face-to-face. Justice is my relationship to the fact that there's a face-to-face here and a face-to-face here and a face-to-face here. There are other people standing around. How do you negotiate all those infinite, unlimited face-to-face interactions at the same time? You can't. So justice is finding a way of doing the best you can within that context, of trying to implement the ethical. The ethical is the face-to-face, the two. But justice is what happens when you have three, because my other person, my neighbor, has a neighbor, and it's not me. And that neighbor has a neighbor, it's not him. And so if you're engaged with all of them, don't you have equal responsibility to each one? And how do you negotiate that? What if they conflict? That's the question of justice. Justice, and for Levinas, he'll say that the Bible is a way of trying to negotiate justice when you're trying to implement the ethical obligation, but you have some impossibilities because you have infinite obligation to this and infinite obligation to that and. Okay. One of the conferences that Levinas was part of a group called the. He was part of a French group that had a series of conferences. The name escapes me for the moment. But French group that had a series of conferences, and one of the conferences was difficult justice. Justice is itself very difficult because it's the attempt to be ethical in a context that seems to exceed the ethical. How do you exceed the infinite, the unlimited? You have unlimited responsibility. How do you exceed it? How do you do justice? All right. So All right. So there, bottom of 89. How is it that there is justice? I answer that it is the fact of the multiplicity of human beings, the presence of someone next to the other, which conditions the laws and establishes justice. If I am alone with the other, I owe him everything. But there's someone else. Do I know what my neighbor is in relationship to someone else? Do I know if someone else has an understanding with him or is his victim? Who is my neighbor? It's consequently necessary to weigh, to think, to judge incomparable, comparing the incomparable, the interpersonal relation I establish with the other, I must also establish with other men, or other human beings. There is thus a necessity to moderate this privilege of the other, from whence comes justice. Justice, exercised through institutions which are inevitable, must always be held in check by the interpersonal. And I've spent time because I think this raises some of the issues that you were talking about in relationship to the medical that we were getting at before. We only have like a minute here, and but I do want to point you to the page where he says, I can find it quickly, the page where he says, responsibility for the mortality of the others. Mortality of the other. Okay, here it is. All right. So responsibility for the other, for the death of the others on page 118. So if we just jump in our last moments here, to page 118. Let's speak about your most recent work nowadays. Bottom of 118, Philippe, Nemo. Nowadays you extend your mediation on responsibility for the other by a mediation on responsibility for the other's death. What should we understand by that? I think that in responsibility for the other, one is in the final analysis responsibility for the death of the other. Is not the rectitude of the other's look an exposure par excellence, an exposure unto death? The face in its uprightness is what is aimed at point blank by death, aimed at point blank by death. What is expressed as demand in it certainly signifies a call to giving and serving, or as the commandment to giving and serving. But above this, and while including it, the order is not to let the other alone, be it in the face of the inexorable. This is probably the foundation of sociality, and of love, without eros. The fear for the death of the other is certainly at the basis of the responsibility for him. Such a fear is something other than fright. I think this notion of fear for the other, fear for the other, not fear of the other, fear for the other man, contrasts with the brilliant analyses that Heidegger made of affectivity, of sentiments, of emotion, befindlichkeit. Every emotion has, according to him, what he calls a double intentionality for its emotion before something and for something. Fear is fear about what is terrifying. There's also a fear for myself. Heidegger insists on that. Let's move past it. In what sense? And he says in top of 120, disinterested fear, timidity, shame, in any case, not fear of sanction, but one fears for the other and not for oneself. Can one even have? Can one even live? This is, in fact, the question one must ultimately pose. Should I be dedicated to being? By being, by persisting in being, do I not kill? Should I be? Is it righteous to be? Is it righteous to live? To be sure, now that the biological paradigm has become familiar to us, we know that every species lives at the expense of another, and that at the interior of each species, every individual replaces another. One cannot live without killing. Levinas, in societies such as it functions, one cannot live without killing, or at least without taking the preliminary steps for a death of someone. Consequently, the important question of the meaning of being is not, why is there something rather than nothing, which is Leibniz's question. The Leibnizian question to so much commented upon Heidegger. But do I not kill by being? Even though from the, he says, even though from this acknowledgement one cannot live without murder, blah, blah, blah. Let's skip to Levinas. The explosion of the human in being, the breakthrough of being, about which I have spoken in the course of these interviews, the crisis of being, the otherwise than being, are indeed marked by the fact that what is most natural becomes the most problematic. Do I have the right to be? Is being in the world not taking the place of someone? The naive and natural perseverance in being is put into question. Okay, I think we're ready to stop here. Is there something more that you want to share?
Okay, thank you very much for explanation. And maybe someone has a question. I have a question. Based on your explanation or outline of Emmanuel Levinas, and if there is the face-to-face interaction, including justice, responsibility for the other. Let's imagine that there was a really big issue in healthcare during COVID that we would name as triage. Triage. Yeah, triage, where health professionals had to distribute, let's say, beds. There were more people in need, than the healthcare resources were able to tackle it, and doctors had to sort out between patient decisions. Yeah, and now you are looking face to face to a patient in need, and you're worried about fear for the patient there, but there are other patients in the sense of there is. Right. There are other patients, and they are also in need. That's right. And so you have interpersonal, face-to-face interaction with some of them, but others are just somewhere or there that are also in need. And so there is a question of justice. So like obligation to specific patients with a face-to-face interaction, but also there's a question of justice that there might be or there are others
There are
in need. How would you imagine? How would it look like now, looking from the Levinasian perspective? Is it possible to manage such situation in ethical way? Just your idea.
Well, I would hope to have fewer engagements with such difficult. I don't have a sense of this is the right way, or this is the ethical. I don't have an ethical answer. The ethical is the ethical, whether we can fulfill it or not. I mean, it may be that we're in a situation in which it becomes impossible to fulfill the ethical. For Levinas is very, very clear that the ethical is something. It's only ethical if I do it, if I observe it. The ethical is the ethical, even if I can't do it. He said he's not advocating an ethical. He's simply describing what is the ethical. And it's important for him that this is what you said is precisely put your hands on the ethical problem when you want to remain within the ethical, but you're facing a quandary in which all moves are bad. This is what we face the king there, right? Every move is bad. Any move you want to make in the game is a bad move, and not to play the game is a bad. That's a bad time. That's a tough time. It may be that circumstances don't allow the ethical to triumph. There's no guarantee that the ethical is going to triumph. It remains the ethical nonetheless. But it may be that given the nature of reality, or the nature of I hesitate to say human beings. I think we try to be ethical if we can, if we're interested in following something else and understanding what ethics is. But we used to try to understand what ethics is, but it remains the ethical even if we can't do it. And so it's not that there is a right answer, or Levinas would say there is a right answer for what to do. But he gives us a better understanding of the dimensions of the difficulties, and an awareness of the difficulties, so that maybe if we closely read the situation, we can find an unexpected outcome. It turns out that there's a whole stash of unused beds there that I suddenly by chance happen to find, and I can bring into play because I'm aware that this is a situation that may not have a good outcome, and I'm not necessarily a bad person because there's no good outcome here. But it may be that if I look at the situation carefully enough, I'll spot something that others have not spotted, and maybe there's no guarantees. There's no guarantee that the ethical will triumph. It remains the ethical whether it triumphs or not. There's no guarantee that it will triumph. There's no guarantee of justice. We can only say we want justice, and we invent books like the Bible to try to figure out what's the just thing to do. We read writers like Levinas to figure out what's the just thing to do. And so maybe the best thing we can do, it's going to sound strange, because it's so mild, is read. And continue to read and learn to read more and more closely, so that if and when certain, by chance, by luck, others would say by God, things happen to show up, we can take advantage of them. But from a Levinasian point of view, there's no guarantee. But it doesn't. There's no guarantee. Number one. Number two, it doesn't challenge that there is an ethical foundation for justice.
Thank you very much for explanation. Similarly, there might be ethical dilemmas. Again, face-to-face interaction and social justice.
Yes.
Let's imagine there are situations when, let's say, especially in case of rare diseases, where treatment is very expensive, and you need to distribute resources.
Yeah.
And then you need to choose between one person helping one person, or helping, let's say, 100 or 1,000 people.
Yeah.
And let's imagine a situation. There might be situations when there comes this one patient, looks at you, at your eyes, and you are looking at his or her eyes, and there is like there comes personal responsibility for this patient. But also you understand that now you are creating a situation where that might have to become a rule. If you help this one person, then there will be more of them. And then you cannot always help everyone. How to deal with this case? Refuse, let's say, to face during this face-to-face interaction, or get engaged. So it might be very challenging. I can't say no to this specific person, but when I think from perspective of justice, then I'm thinking about everyone and finding some optimal ways of dealing with the majority's needs.
Yeah.
And so, would refusal to do something good to a person in the face-to-face interaction in such cases be seen as unethical? Well, should the person feel guilty?
I don't know that there are any shoulds involved here at all. I mean, it seems to me what we're describing is what happens all the time in very small ways, and it only becomes critical in times of crisis, like COVID, or diminution of resources, diminution of money, diminution of different available means of dealing with situations. But I don't think there's a right answer. I think the answer is we will do what we will do, and you have to try to proceed. He will say in the chapter we didn't read. He talks about the prophetic. He says the Bible is a book of the prophetic, but it's what I call the futuristic prophetic, not the retrospective prophetic. It's common for us to say, oh look, that guy said that 10 years ago, and now it has come to pass. He was prophetic, as if that's what I call the retrospective. That to me is not what the Bible is about. The prophets are saying here in the future, we need to see, we recognize the dramas in which human beings are engaged, and we can name in advance the end of those dramas in order that we can choose to go there or not. And so I think the answer, my answer would be, and I think Levinas's answer would be, to read prophetically. In other words, to begin to as much extent as we can, because we don't know what we've missed. And maybe we say, okay, if I take this path, this is like that. If I go take this path, this is like that. In other words, nothing is fixed. The situation is always in motion. We're always in motion in all regards. We're tired, or we're well rested, or there are more people to show up to help, or there are fewer people to help these days, or we're in a country that's just been bombed. There's all kinds of things keep changing over and over and over again. And so what we need are tools to have as much information on which you can make ethical decisions as possible. And those tools, Levinas will say, and the last chapter is the prophetic. And for him, the Bible is nothing but a reading of the prophetic. And he attributes, I really didn't say this, he attributes to great literature prophetic reading. That's why I like Levinas, and why, for me, it's a very, very valuable way of thinking about literature, because literature teaches us to read prophetically. Here's what's going on. Here's the dramas that are afoot. Here's what's happening in this situation. Because yes, there's this, and there's this, and there's this that's lacking, and it's creating problems. But there's always this possibility, and there's always this possibility. And maybe this will happen. Maybe if I just do this and didn't think about it, this will happen. Maybe this will happen. So it doesn't, again, there's no guarantees, but becoming a better reader might be the best tool that we have. It's not a guarantee. There's no guarantee that it's going to work. There are no guarantees. That's what we're stuck with. And maybe if we find ourselves making too many quick decisions, and then in retrospect say, oh look, I didn't realize that just around that corner there was a whole box of things that I could have used in this context, a whole set of beds that I didn't realize or being unused and just been left off. And in other words, I think we have to learn to read. I think the advocacy here, if there is one, is for reading. That's what I would end up.
And then the comes the question: can we find in all of this, all of these dilemmas, some situations where you cannot find some best way? Does it relate to the notion of trauma?
Trauma.
Because it's traumatic.
It's traumatic.
Face-to-face interaction, especially if you cannot develop, for example, and it brings you.
Well, I'm not entirely sure I understand what you're asking, because trauma, it would be definitely devastating. It would be devastating. But trauma, I myself like to reserve for the black box where there's something that I can't remember, that I don't have the capacity to see. So I would say that it's devastating. It always brings on what's devastating, and maybe I have or someone has a habit of fleeing from what's devastating. So we have to learn to have a thicker skin, as they say, to devastation, and recognize that not all appearance of blood means that someone is going to die. I mean, for example, new doctors have to learn that. I mean, cutting. I mean, this is the classic case of someone who can't cut into a body, and they're not going to make it in medical school, because you have to learn that not all cutting into a body means that the person that you're a bad person or the person is going to die. But you have to be able to live with increasing, not only increasing reading skills, but increasing capacity for living with devastation and not having it debilitating you. Maybe.
I have some questions, but maybe next meeting?
Sure.
Discuss a little bit more.
Yeah. It's an ongoing discussion. Yeah.
Okay, so thank you, Professor,
Thank you.
for a very interesting talk and reading of Levinas. Thanks everyone for joining us. Don't forget to join us next time in 2 days, and it will be on Othello.
Well, no, 2 days on Oedipus. Oedipus Tyrannus, Sophocles' play Oedipus Tyrannus. Oedipus Tyrannus, which should be available digitally again through Ingrida. How can they don't have access? Because I'd like them, if possible, to read the Velapa translation, which she has, and she is able to send that to them, or to give to people who are registered. What is? I don't know what's going on with that. How does that work?
We will think about it.
We'll think about it. Okay, sounds good.
So thanks a lot, and have a nice evening. Bye.